Welcome to The History in the Shadow. Today, we here with another historical episode of History Priceless Moments. Please subscribe our channel if you like our videos. Let's start the story. The origin of Lyme Limmies had been knights from 1100 AD, and probably well before this too. Gilbert's predecessors may well have come from the continent with William the Conqueror. We came, we saw, we stayed, so to speak. However, we cannot confirm this but we do know the term Limmer was in use before they came, and it being lord of the moiety of Lymme in Cheshire in King John's time. 1199 AD. 4 Cheshire, the county in which Lymme resides, had been a source of lime since late Roman times. Under the period from Henry II to King John, 1189 to 1200 AD, buildings of bricks and lime mortar rose fast. Castles, no longer made of wood, now become stone layered in lime mortar. Substantial buildings built in Saxon times now shift in focus from war to peace as towns and cities increase in size rapidly. Large quantities of lime traveled over land by horse and cart. The plea rolls describe Lymme's lands as plots of the romantic notion that people could just become a knight needs clarifying. A knight would have been schooled for the post from the age of 7 upward. A knight would be able to read, write, and speak 3 languages: Latin, French, and English. He would be expected in lands in and around Lymme, Cheshire 6 in recognition of knight service in the army of King Richard I. He became known as Gilbert de Lymme. While installed in the army, presumably between Crusades, Gilbert de Lymme had at least 3 sons, all of whom became knights. The older son, also Gilbert by name, later moved to Thingwall, installed as Lord of the Manor of Lee. This son of Gilbert Lymme became known as Gilbert de Lymme VII. Quite when Domvilles became Lord of the Manor at Lymme cannot be fully determined. Gilbert de Lymme served King Richard I as knight out of loyalty to the crown. But his descendants, possibly influenced by Gilbert Jr., saw the benefits of subcontracting their services. The Domvilles, who already owned much land in Chester, received requests for fighting men from the king. To supplement his quota, Domvilles contracted the services of the de Lymme family to fight under their banner. De Lymmes fought for the king just as they had done before, but with the added bonus of naming an ever-increasing price as the subcontractor. The disadvantage to this sort of arrangement was that knights fought the Bucklow Hundreds, refers to de Lymme. As the Lymmies of Lymme, Gilbert de Lymme installed as Lord of the moiety of Lyme in King John's time. The family of Lymme took their surname from the place. The family remained as Lord of the Manor until King Edward II, 1316. Barry records office. The Lymmies of Lee also took their name from the seat of authority given with the Manor of Lee. Thus, the Lymme family branched into the Lee family. The origin of lime under other colors and any commendations in battle went to the employer's credit. Lymmes interact with Domvilles throughout their family story. The Domvilles have their part to play in the migration of Lymmes from Cheshire to Suffolk. 8 The Domvilles of Lymme, Cheshire, traced their descent from one of William the Conqueror's Norman followers. See Burke's peerage and baronetage under Domville and Domville. Domville's seat of influence centers around Lancashire and Yorkshire. An account of the family in the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries appears in the Domvilles of Brimstage and Oxton, Vol 103 of the Lancashire and Cheshire Record Society series. In the person of Hugh de Domville, the family first appears holding the lordship of Oxton in the middle of the 12th century. In about 1215 or 1216, the manors of Brimstage and Oxton were held by Sir Robert Domville, and his name appears as witness to a couple of Cheshire deeds and as witness to one for Eggleston Priory in Yorkshire. The migration of Lymmes to Suffolk was assisted when the Lymmes entered the service of Domvilles as knights and stayed on in their service after the major wars, looking after the interests of their masters. Lymme and Domville merge when John Domville's son Robert married, in or before 1342, Agnes, daughter of Thomas de Legge, and became the ancestor of the Domvilles of Lymme. Thomas de Legge was Gilbert de Lymme's brother's son. The name changed from Lymme to Legge to take the name of the manor of which he was lord. He legacy of Lymme, he ravaging of land for profit and leaving it as wasteland, seems to have expanded the term Limmer. Lymmes seem to have been quiet ruthlessness and profiteering. Not only did they strip the land but in the courts they showed little mercy to their debtors. If defaulters could not pay, these knighted fellows would take the value by force. During the 15th century, the country itself divided in 2 ways. It divided between East and West England. Those on the east were mainly loyalists, while those on the west sought a parliament. England also divided between gentry and commoner. The rich ruling class would communicate in French and Latin while commoners continued with Saxon English. Many names of places and people changed as they passed between the lips of commoner and gentry. Lord of the manor, and many dignitaries became surnamed by notoriety only to be derided by the commoner who had his own version of the place. Question: what did knights do between Crusades? Answer: look for ways to make more money at home. Actually, it is not at all clear that Gilbert de Lymme, who the plea rolls describe Lymme's lands as plots of separate functional pieces, while Bucklow Hundred's account describes how Gilbert Lymme's land became worthless wasteland by late 11th century. It looks like the Lymmes of Lymme mined their land too. Page 23. Some of the knights placed upon their armor signs that were different from another in order to be known thereby, while others placed them upon their heads or on their horses. Les de Partida, Spanish poet, 1051 AD. The legacy of Lymme became a fighting knight under Henry II, went to the Crusades. Whether any Lymmes ever fought in the Crusades I do not know, but I rather think they hired themselves out to cover for fighting service at home. The hunting of green lion, thou wilt find truth in these werke. But if so be thou be lay, and understand not I say, keep counsel then and leave thy toy, for it benefits no limmer loy to meddle these high philosophy. My counsel take for thou shalt find it true. English alchemical verse. It might better be supposed that Gilbert fought for the king in retaking Cumbria and Northumberland back from the Scottish King Malcolm IV. This campaign started from the district of Lymme in Cheshire. A number of people took part in the campaign and afterwards settled in the north of England. Commoners often used surnames of their rulers in derogatory ways as a way of handling their submission, so these were soon referred to as Limmers, not because they were descendants of Gilbert de Lymme, but because they began the push for the north from Lymme. Northerners used the term Limmer in contempt of such coarse conquerors, not only because they took their land but also because they left it in a ruined state. While we are here, perhaps we can ask the question, did the page 24 history of Limmer's greater influence come from place Lymme or trade of Lymingi? The answer is, both seem to have reinforced it. The place and the trade grew together. Situated near Lincoln, Great Limber, Limber Parva and Limber Magna were major sources of lime by the 12th century. Wooden buildings gave way quickly to the new building techniques of brick and stone. The lime industry grew rapidly to keep up with demand. On the eastern side of the country, Chester and Lymme produced companies to process lime for the building industry. Lime supplied by local yeomen was sold to people like John Limmer, who formed a company, John Limmer Company, c. 1260, later known as Limmer and Company. By 1265 their main office was near Bury St. Edmunds, and branched as William Limmer of Cambridge. Adam Limmer formed another company in Cambridge around the same time. 10 Those applying their trade to new stone buildings became known as limers because they were cementing with lime. John, William and Adam all belonged to one family, but early writers spelled their names several ways in one document. Thus, Limmer, Limmer, Limer and Limar are assigned to the above, simply because they are all pronounced the same way. 11 It would depend on the background of the scribe. Was he, and it was usually a male profession, used to writing the French way, the Latin way, or the emerging English way. Generally, those who took their name from the trade settled nicely to Limer or Limor, while those from the place or the tribe settled to Limmer. Quiet, often the spelling would be written several different ways in one document. Sorting out which was which becomes a headache, but generally the context or some external evidence gives the game away. 10 Ref. Buckingham Records Office Index of Trades. 11 Local accent may account for much of this. Page 25 History __ Brief 1. From Rome to Saxon. Page 26 From Rome to Saxon. By 450 AD, the Romans were militarily stretched and recalled their troops from England. This was the signal for a free-for-all. Danes, Celts, Vikings, Mercian, and Saxons each tried to secure an ever-increasing share of a limited island. Many Saxons serving in the Roman army decided to stay and brought their families over from Germany. Archaeological evidence shows a Saxon settlement of c. 500 AD in Suffolk, but there is no evidence of Limmers among them. By c. 1100 AD, however, we see a much evidence of Limmers settled in Hampshire. While evidence of the term Limmer exists prior to c. 900 AD, the first tangible evidence of a Saxon family from the town Limmer in Germany begins to unfold. Limmers from Limmer were forced out of their castle by the House of Hanover, who wanted it for a monastery, and thus begins my tale. Local accent history of Limmers, page 27, interlude, interest 1. Language. Since the 6th century, the Jutes, Saxons, and Angles resolutely refused to succumb to Latin or French language. English, or the anglicized takeoff Angli-Saxons, has submerged and re-emerged, altered time and again. Its biggest influence on names and places occurred during the Middle Ages. By 1000 AD, French had a strong influence. By 1200 AD, Latin had conquered law, politics, and history writing. By 1400 AD, Latin became the norm for official documents such as customs and excise, births, deaths, or marriages, which were handled by the church, where Latin was prominent. Middle English emerged through Latin, radically different from Old English by 1600. Henry V made a marked request that English be the language of literature. Many Latin and French writings were translated into English at this time. French to Latin changes drop de or la, French verb, and the, as in Gilbert of Lymme or de la Selle, of the room. Latin uses the context to make an association between subject and object, and it is written as Gilbert Lymme, no longer Gilbert of Lymme. Latin to English changes influence surnames like Limmer mainly in the Y and I, and in the usage of in R. The use of Y as an I, sounding like I to replace an IE as in pie, meant that Lyme could become Lim. Clerks, who needed to write in 3 languages, often combined them, changing the I to Y, but leaving the E as in Limmy. As common folk began to read for themselves, Y followed by E changed the Y sound back to I as in pin. Several reasons have been suggested for the adding of R. These include showing Y is short, emphasizing the final M in a verbal society, distinguish Limmy from Limba, for example, or denoting a trade or activity from a seat of authority, as in Limmer a limewright or Limber a tracklayer rather than mayor of Limmy. This argument, however, remains to be demonstrated by its advocates. Doggone Limmer hunting had taken place since Saxon times, but the Norman Conquest gave it new vigor. During the time of relative peace, the knights and gentry needed to keep their fighting skills intact. Barons would drive out whole villages of peasants in order to use forestry for their sport. They would justify the need, saying knights and fighting men needed to keep up training. This might seem an extravagant excuse in the light of hunting today, but the savages of a wild boar, bull, or cornered stag injured more knights than the Crusades. Doggone Limmer required to do archery practice daily during this period. Limmer became common in the language around this time in 2 ways. First, kings and knights went hunting in their new laid forests. In Saxon times, hunting would be for rabbits or game birds, so the common hound was a useful dog to sniff out the catapulted food and bring it back to master. Hunting now became bigger and more ruthless. Poaching had to take care of the need for food, whereas hunting for larger animals like stag, bull, and wild boar became the sport of the rich. The common hound was not ferocious enough to tackle bigger beasts, so it was crossed with a mastiff to make it ferocious. This cross between a mastiff and a hound, known as a Limmer hound, is said to have taken its name from its breeder. Limps of Cheshire and Nottingham, besides being known for their ruthless manner, also attended the forest hunts with kings to chase wild pig and king's deer using these dogs. It is a small step to associate a derogatory remark about the ruthless behavior of the knights with the dogs they led. Some higher classes referred to this dog as a Limmer hound or Limeshound. Perhaps the first denotes the vicious nature and the second the breeder's name. This new breed has the distinction of being the first dog to be leashed. Alluding to this animal's qualities, in the poem The Hunting of Green Lion, the writer draws a parallel with the ferocious killing nature of the dog that rendered the carcass useless and the nature of the recent trend in society to destroy the foundational philosophies of society. From the footnotes of The Sultan of Babylon we can read, an eland is a highly prized ferocious dog of a breed used in hunting, bull baiting, etc. A Limmer is a hound trained to be led on a leash and to track game by scent. Rack refers to a dog, the English knight. Page 30, History of Limmers that hunts by scent, MED. Again, according to Cummins, 13, c. 1450, it was the job of the limer or limmer, trainer/keeper of the limmer or hunting dog, or local forester or parker, to direct the master of game to the best eligible hart as quarry. Ferocious knights were said to fight like a limmer. Today we simply say, fight like a dog. Northumbrian thieves were only called limmers if they used violence, for example a mugger. A little later, the rough-cut shafts of a cart became known as limmers because of the way they were hacked roughly into shape with an axe. Second, hunting was the sport of kings and barons who forbade commoners to organize or take part in such activities. The king's orders to shire rulers to oust those peasant farmers and create a hunting forest cut across the conscience of many lords. Crossing the king meant losing one's position, if not one's head. For many of these lords, position meant livelihood. There was little option but to ruthlessly drive villagers from their homelands, leaving them to roam. More sensitive lords and barons, those with rather more parliamentary leanings, began to take hold on the eastern side of the country where we find a more lenient approach. 13 John Cummins. The church often helped here, although this might well have an opportunist motive. Around this time, especially in the south of England, bishops cleared church-owned forests for new peasant villages at a rent, of course. One change taking place at this time provided an escape for many lords of conscience. Money began to take the place of goods and lands as repayment of favor. Many on the west side of England, disconcerted by their lot, swapped their land for money or other lands on the west side where the king's influence was greater. Knowing they would lose their land and power, some overlords negotiated to swap allegiance for land and power in another part of England. Lower classes, plebs, commoners or peasants, having little money to carry with them also joined the migration. On arriving, many had to give way to lewd or loose behavior in order to live. On arrival at the town gates, many would be greeted by a notice warning of dress code. Such notices as the one in Figure 3 did little. Page 32. No woman of the city shall henceforth go to market, or be found in the king's highway, out of her house, with a hood furred with other than lambskin or rabbit skin, on pain of loosing her hood to the sheriffs, and this because that regratress's nurses and other servants, and women of loose life, bedizen themselves in guise of good ladies. Figure 3. Notice against hoodies pinned to town gates in c. 1650 AD. History of Limmer's good, because most commoners could not read. Point 14. Quite why the term Limmer became synonymous with low or base fellows around this time is unclear. As we have discussed, it most likely due to the army attacks on northerners originated from Lyme. The term Limmer became a derogatory term like poems, used of Australians against the British today. Women were not excluded from the term. Loose women were also known as limmers. According to Webster, limmer came to mean a low base fellow or prostitute, as in thieves, limmers, and broken men of the Highlands. Sir W. Scott 15. Worse, in these times, when witches were drowned on ducking stools in a local pond, limmer became associated with this dubious profession. In the play Lancaster Witches 16, we read these lyrics. 14. History repeats itself, if not a little differently each time. The term limmer became associated with a number of other inventions. Sailors' rope ladders and ships' gunwales were often referred to as the limmer. In Yorkshire, miners referred to the pit pony's track carrying coal from the pit face to surface as the limmer track. All these terms probably came from the earlier word limber and may have been a corruption of lumber. This gives us a clue as to the change in spelling and pronunciation. While the gentry of the East would accentuate the lie in line, common dialect of West would emphasize the M pronouncing NB as in limb. The same pony track or rope ladder called limmer west of Leicester would be limber in Norfolk or Lincolnshire. Lime towns in Cheshire might be Lyme or Newcastle under Lyme, but in Lincolnshire they were Limber Parva and Limber Magna. This route for the term limmer has been offered as evidence for the change from term to surname, but it remains unproven. If we were to follow a second theory, in which the surname limmer derived from a trade or skill, we must also consider the claim by another source 17 that the name limmer was derived from the ancient trade of illuminators. This theory is less forthcoming with evidence. We might consider the rapid rise in demand for the parchment and legal writing in the 9th and 10th century. Scribes and illuminators of text became very popular around this time. Most early illuminators came from the stock of monks. 18. Celibacy, 17. A Dictionary of English Surnames. P.H. Reaney, R.M. Wilson, page 279. 18a Resurgence in the Art of Illumination by Monastic Scholars after 1350. The Oxford Illustrated History of Medieval England, Nigel Saul. Some illuminators did work outside the monasteries. Descendants from these include Thomas Liminaire, 1273, while those named Limmer descend from Godfrey le Lumner, c. 1100. Others are known rather as Limner or Lomer in 1402, as in, a bookbinder's owned by Ansty Abbey was rented to Henry Limner. I can find no connection to the surname Limmer 19. Some of the early marriage licenses written by the hands of John, 1703.42, or Edward, 1737.46, Limmer, and presently kept at Bury St. Edmund's Record Office show highly educated and very skillful handwriting, but not to a standard that we might expect of an illuminator. Outside of monasteries, Oxford or Cambridge universities were the best places for training in this field. There are no records of Limmers attending either of these academies and no concrete evidence that links Limmer and the art of illuminating. One source put forward evidence connecting the two, but this was discredited. Catlin, in his research into the Cibbies family, deliberately records the marriage of Elizabeth Cibbies to John Limner. The document from which he copied the surname unmistakably shows the name as John Limmer. His attempt to elevate the class of the Cibbies family by miscopying was declared by Cambridge scholars as poor research, and they added a footnote to this effect. 20 Catlin's need to change Limmer to Limner in order to make the connection between Limmer and Luminer demonstrates the unlikely chance that Limner settled down into Limmer. 19 I have excluded Lumner, Limner, Lomer, and Lumner from investigation. 20 Works of Richard Cibbies, 1790 Banner of Truth. Page 38 History of Limmers. Incidentally, the same source that quoted Catlin wrongly also lists with certainty that Stephen, 1776, Limmer 21 descended from Limmer, whose occupation was a lime burner. As Stephen Limmer was a direct descendant of the John Limmer who married Elizabeth Cibbies, it can hardly be accepted with any certainty that either descend from lime burner or liminaire. Limmer origins and place names. It is said by some that Limmer started as a place name. It has been suggested, by those who favor the Lim to Limmer route of origin, that Gilbert de Lymme came to England, bearing the name of Lim, de Lymme in Roman times, and in doing so named the town? This seems improbable. Which named which? Did the place name the person only after the person had named the place? Did an ancestor travel via Lim, France, Limburg in Holland, Lima in Sweden, or Limit in Switzerland? Some of these lands do contribute. The French version of Limmer is Lemera or Lemmer. John Lemera, for example, probably came from this route 22, or did he derive his name from the time of the Romans when Lyme the town was established? It is clear that Gilbert took the name as Lord of Limmy. Who named Limmy? Limmy has been recognized since Roman times. Romans mined many areas in and around Chester for lime and a lime processing kiln at Limmy 21. The source quotes 1776 Stephen Limmer and Elizabeth Dews. St. George. SQI.263 and John Limmer married Elizabeth Cibbies as descending from two separate lines. There can be little doubt that both share the same parentage. 22 John Lemmer 1424. Suffolk surnames. The connection between the place and the trade of can be seen in Gilbert's act of exploiting his land for profit by extracting lime. 23 Limmer and Migration are now in a position to discuss the issue of a migration of Limmer in two ways. First, did the name Limmer migrate from north, or did Limmers migrate to Suffolk from the south of England? During the Middle Ages, there was clearly a migration of people from west to east. In general, there were several reasons why people moved to the east side of the country in this period. First, there was the war with Wales. Chester was a vulnerable county until this war ended. The king's tenements spread throughout Cheshire. The king recruited most of his army from his tenants, thus putting a good deal of pressure on them to take up arms for his cause. Second, the king's new land taxes were fervently pursued in the 5 counties of the east. Chancellor's records for the period show how it could be largely ignored by the counties in the west. Thirdly, to reach ports at Chester, boats traveled close to the Welsh northern coast. Since the general unrest in Wales, which started around 1395, many of the merchant ship owners transferred to Bristol for business and safety reasons. 24. Once the troubles of the 23 The plea rolls describe Limmy's lands as plots of separate functional pieces, while Bucklow Hundred's account describes how Gilbert Limmy's land became worthless wasteland by late 11th century. It looks like the Limmies of Limmy mined their land too. 24 That is probably why John Limmy's company moved to Bristol, as we saw in page 40 History of Limmers. North and Wales quietened. The king's presence moved south. moving between London, Portsmouth, and Essex in response to the pending war with France. Suffolk and its surrounding counties remained sheltered from English troubles. Descendants of Gilbert de Lymme, the knight, had spread quickly southwards by the beginning of the 15th century. Some were still in the employ of the Domvilles and making a good living as knights. By this time, Limmers had established a foothold in counties surrounding Suffolk. Some Lymps had signed up in the fast-growing merchant navy. Others, like John de Lymme, who some time before went to Bristol, used their education to look for desk jobs. The decline of de Lymme families in Cheshire and their appearance in London and Portsmouth coincides with the return of the king to London after the war with Wales. Putting Limmer on the map ID, the map influenced the name Limmer? It is doubtful. Did Limmer influence the map? Most emphatically, yes. One such modern example is Limmer Lane, named where Limmer Bus Company parked their buses the early 1900s. Another is Limmer's Terraces, Bury St. Edmunds. An early map of Bury St. Edmunds shows part of the Limmer family built a terrace, which became a local landmark. Interestingly, Limmer's Terraces also appear in Lyme territory. Limekill Cottages and Lyme Fields, the last chapter. Bristol already had ties with ports in Ipswich, Norfolk. It was easier to transport goods around the coast, stopping off at Portsmouth and Colchester on the way, than it was to carry the goods across land. The Romans had left a good legacy of roads from south to north, but few from east to west. It is improbable that they are connected to the works, however, as these terraces appear to have been built by Limmers working in corn and wheat sales. Having emigrating to USA from Norfolk and returning to Bury around 1800 AD, they built the terraces. Unfortunately, these were demolished and the land sold in early 1900. A number of map references bearing the name Limmer point us back to Saxon times. Their close proximity tells a good deal about the beginnings of Limmer. These are exiting, and we will look at this evidence from earlier maps in Part 225. One further point argued by some must be dispelled before we move on. That Limmer is French in origin is really a non-starter. True, it is a small step from Gilbert de Lymme to make Gilbert de Limmer, but there would surely have been evidence of a de Limmer in a record somewhere before 1390. Most official records were written in French until that date, so the temptation to add the de, if there was any doubt, would have been too great to miss. More than this, the surname de Lymme began to settle down to the surname Lymme 26. By 1480 AD, only names that had incorporated the de or la into the surname survived, e.g. French was on its way out, and the last records of de Lymme recorded by clerks in Bristol, for example, dropped de and la from names as a matter of policy in 1392.27. The decline of Lyme and the increase of Limmer in Norfolk has 25 other modern examples of Limmers leaving a mark on the map. Might be Limmer Hill in Scotland, Limmerhaw in Scotland, Limerick in Ireland, and many more. 26 Hargrave Bishops, transcript 1574 to 1707, Suffolk Records Office. 27 purely observational, but the practice of missing de and la is noticeable in Bristol Records Office records. It seems to have started by the shipping clerks and spread to most departments by 1420 AD. I do not know if this was a directive from within the council, but the practice clearly caught on. Page 42, History of Limmers, been argued as Suffolk Limps becoming Limmers 28. Weigh this against much greater evidence of Limmers moving up through Hampshire, Bedford, and Buckinghamshire to Suffolk and Norfolk. This argument loses its credibility. Limmers moved into Suffolk from the south. 1. Thomas Lymme did buy farmland between Hardist and Hargrave from Thomas Grome 29 in 1455. He may have been one, though bias, or Thomas Limmer living in Buckinghamshire around that time. But first, there is no direct evidence, and second, there is no reason to suspect that he headed the family of Limmers who appear in Hardist and Hargrave soon after 1455. There are recognizable and established Limmer families in Hampshire and possibly in Cambridgeshire at least 1.5 centuries before this. 28 Dictionary of English Surnames. 29 Thomas Lymme among those who bought land from Thomas and Matilda Grome, Gulfrida Smythe and William Trote near Hardist September 10, 1455. NROFLT 1/16823 by 3 page 43 summary. In short, so far it appears then, Roman association with Lyme influenced the Cheshire town of Lymme by its name and industry. Lymme produced the surname Lymme c. 1066, and as a notable family, the name became nationally known. The people of Lymme and the family Lymme both gave rise, by attitude and invention, to the term Limmer to be added to the English language for everyday use. There is no evidence that Lymme gives rise to the surname Limmer. St. George's, Hanover Square, Figure 6. Tuddenham Church, St. George's Church, Hanover Square, built under the 50 New Churches Bill in 1735, and lavish Georgian in style. The church, attended by many of London's elite, has an impressive list of deacons and officers that probably made Stephen feel quite uncomfortable. After their marriage, Stephen and Elizabeth became active workers in the Church of St. Mary Lubone. Timeline: Ethelbert, King of Kent; Redwald, King of East Anglia; Pudu, King of Mercia; Oswald, King of Northumbria; Wulfhe, King of Mercia; Egfrey, King of Northumbria; Senrid, King of Mercia; Mercia; Coulwulf, King of Northumbria. 750 C. Limmers ousted from castle by Hanoverians. Conwulf, King of Mercia; King of West Saxons; Kentishmai Ethelwu. F802 Egbert, King of West Saxons; Edward the Elder, King of Angles and Saxons. 900 C. Limmer Pond, Aldbourne. Edgar acknowledge as overlord British kings and Prince King Edgar. Edward the Martyr. Population of England about 2 million. Ethelred Caote, King of England. Danes and Norwegians. Canute chosen as king. Bastard son becomes king. Harold I. Canute, King. Stephen. Saxon restoration of land. Harold II becomes king. Battle of Hastings. Ironside, King. Second in same year. William II becomes king. Household knights employed for manorial interests. First Crusade. Saxon restoration. Henry I becomes king. Limmer Fields in Hampshire. Saxon restoration. Hatha Canute becomes king. Matilda, Empress Maud, Queen of England. Second Crusade begins. Gilbert becomes fighting knight under Henry II. Horses replace oxen for ploughing. Second Crusade ends. Richard I becomes king. Gilbert given lands in Lymme. First English windmill. Gilbert Jr. becomes knight in John's service. John goes to Chester. Gilbert given seat of Lyme. Magna Carta. Henry III becomes king. Westminster Abbey built. Limmer Company. Cambridge. Third Crusade begins. Gilbert de Lymme Jr. died. Limmer Farm. Booker. Population doubled since 1066 to 6 million. Thomas Limmer late paying Crusade tax. Black Plague begins to kill 1/3 of population. Tax on wool. 1370 C. Limmerhound goes hunting as far back as surnames go. He beginning of a story is a good place to start. But where is that? We cannot go back as far as the Garden of Eden. If we did, we would find Adam had no surname. We must pick up the story at the turn of first millennium in England, when more than 9/10 of the population lived in the countryside. For 200 years, this percentage remained unchanged. Surnames were unnecessary because families worked on small farms and rarely had time to travel far. Late 12th century changed that. Towns began to grow. Oxford and Cambridge grew around their universities. Rochester and Orford in Suffolk grew around their castles. Durham and Lincoln around their cathedrals. One person now had to be distinguished from another with the same name because he no longer worked in the family unit, but traveled to sell his skills. Most middle and upper classes would want to continue the name of the father or grandfather down through the family to denote the line of succession. The firstborn male carried the traditional first name. The second male carried the name of an uncle, and so on. A growing trend after c. 1100 AD gave children the names of kings or lordly persons. In Saxon times, the face of England changed rapidly, almost daily. Many Saxon kings gave way to a rising national monarchy under the invading Norman King William. William of Normandy fought long and hard during this consolidation. 20 years after his invasion, only 2 major estates remained in English hands. As far back as surnames go, country, forcing the other half to adapt and accommodate. William, having imposed the feudal system, rewarded many of those who fought with him with huge estates, in return of course for a regular donation to his coffers. Many of the poor but free peasants under Edward the Confessor, 1042 AD, ousted from their land and possessions, were now forced to become bondsmen under new lords of the local manor. Limmers were here well before 1000 AD. It is hard to establish where and when they came. Earliest theories might suggest c. 450 AD 30 or as late as c. 700 AD 31. We can say with some authority that at a time when Saxon chief Woke was establishing his people in Wokingham and Wokefield, Limmers were establishing their name in history in place names nearby, as we shall see now by taking a second look at some early maps. 30 Gidla's chronology. A second look at the map. Here were 2 batches of Saxon that came from Germany. The first arrived on the east coast and settled straight away in Suffolk. One argument against the Limmers settling in Suffolk with the first batch of Saxons that come from Germany around 400 AD was the non-existence of place names in Suffolk. When people emigrate, they like to take with them a part of their history. Such were those that emigrated to America from Britain. They took with them the place names like New Hampshire, New Jersey, New Buckingham, and so on. There is no evidence of this in Suffolk. This is not true in the area of Buckingham, Berkshire, Hampshire, and Wiltshire where the second batch landed. Take a map and put the pin of a compass in a little village called Lower Froyle in Hampshire. Then draw a 30-mile radius around that point. Within that circle, we find any number of references to Limmers. This second batch arrived around 800 AD, landing on the south coast because the King of Kent had set up a coast guard. Looking at this map, we find the most likely origin of the early Limmer family. Records of people before 1400 AD are a rare commodity, unless, of course, they belong to the foremost families of England. Anyone not belonging to the 20 or so ruling families before the Middle Ages would have left few clues as to their existence. Documentation belonged to aristocracy and nobility. They documented everything to do with themselves, but little to do with subservient England. A second look at the map Hampshire Limmers, the mention of Saxons, leads us into the discussion that Limmers came from Germany. Limmer, a town of Germany, was in the middle of Saxon lands. History books tell us that Rome drafted fighting Saxons into its army, especially during the decline of its empire. Saxons were among the Roman troops that built Hadrian's Wall. Limmers were certainly fighting people having their own castle in the upper region of Germany, which they defended regularly. This they did successfully until the army of Hanover overpowered them, turned them out as refugees, and used Air Castle as a monastery. 33. Early Saxons were among those who made up the 2, 6, and XX legions of Rome as they built Hadrian's Wall c. 130 AD. 34. However, the identity of these people as far as these isles were concerned was Roman. To identify as anything else would have been unthinkable to anyone serving in the army of Rome. Such contempt for the Roman army gave rise to the term Sassenach 35, not Limmer 36. 33. Translating the German Tourist Board's literature on the district of Limmer, which runs something like this: the castle Limmer lay central in the rural area of the Counts of Clearing, who called themselves after their master seats in Limmer. The earliest documents of Limmer, the town, are thought to be the Count's record of c. 1190 AD. By this time, Limmer Castle, which had possibly stood on the site in one form or another for 500 years, was again in the process of being modified by the Count's orders to accommodate a church and monastery. 34. Barbarian secrets of the Dark Ages. Richard Rudgley 35. Referring to Saxon attackers, it has been argued that northern Limmers came over with the Romans and stayed. But again, Limmer Hill in the north has little evidence of other settlements around it to suggest a Limmer infiltration during this period. One attractive theory arises from recent archaeological digs in West Stow, Suffolk. As the population of Saxon Germany declines around 400 AD, the presence of Saxons increases in Suffolk. Gabor, curator of Schleswig Museum, claims that in a period of 9 years, the large boats built by these Saxons could have carried at least 30,000 people to settle in Britain. 37. Given the prominence of Suffolk in the family line of Limmer after c. 1500 AD, where the first wave of Saxons settled, we must ask the question: did the name originate there? While the argument against is the lack of place names associated with Limmer in Suffolk holds, Buckinghamshire and Berkshire are littered with Limmer place names. This also fits with history. In 409 AD, Rome came under threat from Vandals and other growing forces. Under this threat, it withdrew its forces from England. Saving face, they declared England fit and ready to defend its own land for Rome. Meanwhile, the Angles and Saxons in Germany were facing hunger from a famine and looking for more lands that are fertile for its people. Thus, they came to England. This first influx in the 6th century was in main Jutes and Angles, who were generally the more aggressive tribes. During this time, Limmers appear to be still firmly grounded in their wooden castle near Hamburg, Germany. 38. Fishing, or more probably pirating the Danes, in the North Sea. During this period, while aggressively deforesting the forestland, they attracted the attention of the Hanoverian. 39. 37. Barbarian secrets of the Dark Ages. Richard Rudgley 38. The English Chronicle Limmers came with the second wave of Anglo-Saxons immigrating England. 40. After the exile from their own lands, forced out by the armies of Hamburg around 540 AD, they came to these shores as refugees in search of another land. Being excellent longboat builders, 41. They transported their families by the hundred to England. Unable to land on the east coast at Essex as their predecessors had done, This was now under the control of the King of Mercia. They continued round the coast to a little cove at Felpham. At Felpham we find our first landmark, Limmer Lane. Limmer Lane is still there today, although it is now a tarmac Adam road on private land. At one time, this lane ran down to a little village cove, long since claimed by the sea. Now the lane comes to a halt at a seawall. Nonetheless, it is easy to see Saxon ancestors landing in their 30-foot wooden boats and arriving as refugees from the continent. History has moved on little from those days. Disembarked, our ancestors could quickly scramble up the steep, narrow-tracked path into the King's Forest, where at last they could relax and feel safe in a landscape similar to the one they had left behind. Perhaps pioneer relatives welcomed Limmers as they docked, guiding them up the narrow track. This lane, later called Limmer Lane, was a common route for Saxons to travel in and out the dense woods to fish or loot. The first Limmer settlement in Hampshire was less than 5 miles into the forest at a town named Norton. This is where they left their second mark when they cleared a few uncouth and in need of a lesson. So they attacked them, ousted them, and turned their castle into a monastery. 40 Beta's Ecclesiastical History, 41 Archaeological Research shows they were skilled boat builders, and one estimate is that more than 30,000 came by boat in less than 9 years. Saxons, being good fishermen, could travel this route to the coast without being noticed. Limmers, having entered Britain this way, no doubt had a boat or two hidden in the little cove that once existed at the end of Limmer Lane. This was a little-known path in a deserted part of countryside and surrounded by forest. Small wonder then, a few hundred years on from this moment of history, Limmer Lane would be the ideal spot for smugglers to transport their contraband between shore and woodland. Strangely enough, the heavily taxed contraband being smuggled at this later date was wool. A limekiln and builder's yard at the seaward end of the lane existed sometime before the 18th century. Limmers, thought to have owned the land for several hundred years, worked the kiln until around 1880. A number of Limmer families grew up around this landmark between 1700 and 1880, but the 400-year gap between the track's origin and its later occupants in no way proves them direct descendants. Of course, safe arrival in Britain had no guarantee. Navigation was good for the day, but weather forecasting was not. It may have been bad weather or an unwelcoming committee of sodders that turned a few boats away from the mainland. Whatever the reason, at least one boat with Limmers on board landed on the Isle of Wight. Having landed, they were not going back, so they built their camp and marked the land as Limerstone. I digress. Let us return to the immigrants arriving at Felpham. Let us move with them up the steep but narrow Limmers track for about 500 meters. Now we are safe in the King's Forest. Here, within the vast forest, a Limmer community had set up camp. Arriving at a village now called Norton, 43 Saxon Limmers felled trees and built houses. However, more than this, they dug the pond bearing their name. After all, water is so essential to the village life. That they dug the pond at all suggests they intended to settle here, at least for a while. The Saxon villagers called the amenity Limmer Pond, grateful no doubt for this asset. We too are grateful as it served as a landmark to their presence more than 1,000 years later. Take note of this pond digging skill. It passes down the generations of Limmers, and we will see it again as we examine other sites in Hampshire. Unfortunately, the pond is no more. It survived long enough to be on the 1845 Ordnance Survey map, but not long enough to survive the intensive farming practices of late 20th century. There is a landscaped pond nearby at the nursery. This pond can be dated around the mechanical digger era, c. 1990 AD. Some of the people to whom I spoke on a recent visit referred to this present water feature as Limmer Pond, but others, who had lived in the village all their lives, still remembered the old landmark. Limmer Pond House, likewise a product of the expanding agricultural nursery complex, takes its name from the ancient pond once at the end of its garden. How long those first Limmers stayed in this village cannot be determined. For myself, I feel sure they were there when the monks 43. There are many Nortons or Saxon villages in England. Some have disappeared off the map, others remain. It takes a closer investigation of each to discover who the prominent clan within the village was. Some Saxon villages incorporated more than one clan, but the chiefs or elders of the clan often left a clue somewhere close by. On this observation, I base an assumption that the elders or chiefs of this Norton are Limmers because of the most essential amenity nearby, the pond is named after them. Who knows if these resident Limmers were the skilled laborers who laid the foundations for the early Saxon church at Aldingbourne c. 700 AD. Limmers certainly cooperated with the church. If this was not the beginning of a long relationship, it began soon after. After the king had conquered and unified southern England, these lands were handed over to the Bishop of Winchester. All the Limmer landmarks we mention in this chapter came under the See of Winchester and have a connection to it. Although there is no record of Limmers joining the church as monks or priests, they certainly work within the church organization, at Guildford Friary and possibly Abingdon, for example. We must hurry along in history by skipping a few hundred years. Not that this is our choice, rather we have no evidence of what Limmers got up to in those between years. The end of the first millennium and the beginning of the second marks a time when we can pick up the story again. The changing face of England, the face of England has changed by 1000 AD. England has a shape that we can still recognize today. The church is consolidating, the kings are conquering. These two forces are cooperating to a large degree in order to control most of the land. Where villagers are managing their lands well, they were left to do so, but under a new system of hierarchy. Peasants answered to village elders, elders answered to manors, manors to hundreds and hundreds to lords, barons and sheriffs carefully chosen by the king. Kings, who still have one eye on each other, are forced to unify against bigger hostile enemies from the continent. Immigrants by the boatload infiltrate Kent, Essex, and Hampshire daily. An elementary system of law and order is established to settle internal disputes. Documentation catches on to satisfy law and order. Manors being obliged to establish local courts to settle land demarcations on the one hand, find the need to document boundaries while on the other being required to raise money for taxes, find the need to document fines and key money transactions. On a bigger scale, Bede, a monk of the monastery in Monkwearmouth, Jarrow, has a very clear picture of what is going on, documenting the gossip of the day in detail, while the Saxon chronicles record and preserve daily life for history. By 860 AD, wills are being written and respected. The church is gaining uniform support at a greater rate than kings who are still fighting each other. This understanding of history is the springboard for our next investigation into the Limmers. Page 64, Map 1. Limmer Pond, Aldingbourne, pre-1700, modern postcode P020, 3TU. History of Limmers, page 65, Map 2. Great Limmer Farm, pre-1750, modern postcode HP12. For QR, page 66, figure 7. A painting of Limmer cottages. We are still unable to identify individual Limmers, but we know they are here, not just in England, but particularly in Hampshire 44. At the same time as Saxon chief Woke has established his clan in Wokingham 45 and Wokefield, Peter, another Saxon chief, established his clan in Petersfield. Lyman, also a Saxon chief, is felling Limpsfield 46 for his people. At such a time as this, Limmer is found clearing woodland near Long Sutton known as Limmerfield 47. This landmark remained on the manorial map for at least 500 years and probably longer. In March 1568, the 10th year of Queen Elizabeth I's reign, custody of Limmerfields, which had been assigned to Limmer and heirs forever subject to the manorial custom, came to an end. The land consisted of 9 acres of land, and 44 Hampshire was somewhat larger than it is now. The border with Wiltshire in its west side was under dispute until 1300 AD when Hampshire conceded Chute Forest to Wiltshire. On the east side, Guildford changes sides several times. Hampshire's influence, if not its boundaries, extended north into Berkshire. Mainly under the influence of the See of Winchester, bishops of Winchester had property interest in Berkshire, Wokingham, and High Wycombe. 45 Waka was a Saxon chieftain who sailed to Britain bringing any number of his kith and kin to settle in this area. Wokingham means Waka's people's home, while Wokefield means, you guessed it, Waka's people's home. 46 Limpsfield was known by many names: Lymansfeld, 11 cent; Lymansfeld, Lemnefeld, and Lymansfeld, 13 cent; Limefeld, Lemnesfeld, 14 cent; Lemnisfeld, Lempnesfeld, 15 cent. I do not think the similarity in name to Limmer significant. It probably means elm tree. 47 Limmerfield is referred to in the Crondall Hundreds and Manor records. The spelling Fields leaves open the question if it was originally known as Limmerfield or Limmerfelds. Field would denote established agricultural lands occupied by Limmer, Felds would mean forest lands cleared and claimed by Limmer. While the result is the same, it is more in keeping with the practical skills of Limmers to clear from scrat was given to John Craystone at a manorial hearing. 48. This land had been in the possession of Limmers from the beginning of the manorial system. This is not the only piece of land occupied by Limmers around Long Sutton. We shall return to Long Sutton when we get to meet and name some of them in the next chapter. But at this point, we can see quite a network of Limmers living in this region. There is no mention of Long Sutton Church in the Domesday Book, but there is clear archaeological evidence that a wooden church stood on the present site 49, probably being built at the same time that Limmers were felling the trees for the new Limmerfields Roundhouse estate around 950 to 990 AD. Interestingly, we also find a possible introduction of the Limmer family to the See of Winchester at this point. When King Alfred died, he left the king's estates of Long Sutton to his nephew. King Ethelred then granted Long Sutton to Ethelwold, Bishop of Winchester. With the church in the back garden of Limmersfield, it is hard to think there is no connection. One thing we may be grateful for, Limmers did not cut down 3 magnificent yew trees which, estimated to be between 1800 and 2600 years old, still stand today. Meanwhile, we move on to our next chronological landmark, Great Limmer Farm at Booker. The term great refers to the importance of the farm, not its size, although it was one of the larger farms of its day. Once again, we find it owned by the Bishop of Winchester with the rights of possession given to the Limmer family and heirs forever. The greatness of the farm depended on it being the center from which the taxes and fines of the neighboring farms were. 48 Crondall Manorial Records Court sitting March 29, 1568. 49 A Brief Guide to All Saints Church Long Sutton. Page 68 History of Limmers collected. As these taxes were often in kind, the farm became the grain store and livestock compound of the area. The commoners of Booker also contributed chickens and other such farm produce. This eventually ended up on the table of the friars, monks, and other dignitaries under the see of the bishop in Winchester. By 1409 AD, the farm had a large manor house, occupied by Limmers, and there were 2 cottages that were also occupied by Limmers before that date 50. The original cottages have long since gone, but on the same site, 2 later cottages were built, still bearing the name Limmer Cottages today. These later cottages were painted by Thomas Turner c. 1850, and the original picture, photographed above, belongs to the Marquette family in Canada. Residents living in Limmer Lane, Booker, before 1950 AD can remember the farm as a working farm. The elderly owner and his unmarried daughter sold the farm for housing and retired to the coast. Great Limmer Farm rapidly became a large housing estate through which Limmer Lane runs toward the woodland marking the original track. Our next landmark, Limmer Hill in Basingstoke, is less than 12 miles away. 51 Limmer Close is less than 1 mile from Limmer Hill. 50 Bishop of Winchester's Fines and Other Records, Winchester Records Office. 51 Place names of Buckinghamshire A. Manor and F.M. Stentons. University Press 1925. Also the county map, Jeffreys Bryan. Buckingham, page 69. Wokingham means Waka's people's home. Waka was a wealthy Saxon chieftain who also owned lands at Wokefield in Berkshire and Woking in Surrey. Woos Hill, the settlement of another Saxon people, borders Limmer Hill on the east side. There is an early windmill marked on the hill, but it is close to the border and is unclear if it belonged to Woos or Limmer. One stronghold for Limmer was near Newbury. The estates mapped as Limmer, and the district Limmer was well established in 1403 AD 53. The Limmer family lived in a large dwelling house known as Limmer's Manor and may have been there before 1265 AD. 54. When the Falconer family took over Kingsclere Manor, it was a recognized area. In 1670, one Thomas Lane, a yeoman of Limmer, sold his estate for £340.0055. Sometime after this, the name was lost, but the estate was probably at the north end of Kingsclere Parish, by the River Enbourne. 56 Archaeological Society. 52 Ordnance Survey Maps c. 1810-53 A History of the County of Hampshire. William Page. 54 1 William Limmer from Limmer set up company in Hampshire in 1265 AD. We will meet him in a short while. 55 Receipt Thomas Lane to Abraham Smithman for £340. Purchase money for the estate in DD/6/88. 56 A History of the County of Hampshire. William Page, page 70. History of Limmers. The next landmark to which our attention is drawn is Limmer Copse and Limmer Pond. Limmer Pond, on the borders of Wiltshire and Hampshire, originally found itself in Hampshire and under the bishopric of Winchester. The long-standing boundary dispute between Wiltshire and Hampshire was finally settled around 1500 AD. Today, you can still take a pleasant stroll from Chute 57 through Limmer Copse to see Limmer Pond. Originally attributed to Saxon builders who needed water on higher ground, it is still, in the main, as it was built. Referred to as dew ponds or meres, these ponds are often found on or near commons or woodlands with common access. 58. A second pond, dug on the falling side of the pond, is landscaped to collect the overflow from the original pond. Came later when Limmer Copse was overhauled. 57. Wiltshire County Plan has designated this pond for a special protection order under Historical Interest Order. See WCC Planning Office. 58. John Chandler, a well-respected archaeologist and historian, uses only the phrase Saxon-sounding name to cite evidence of Limmer Pond to suggest Saxon origin, pointing out that Saxon villages depended on ponds and many have Saxon-sounding names such as Limmer, Dummer, or Ashmore. He does not exclude the possibility that the pond was there before Saxon times or that it was named later. Chute is the village bordering this land. Chute has Roman connections and the causeway runs to north of the village. Enclosing Chute at the time of our ditty was a forest. Chute's name comes from a word meaning wood. The whole area around Chute was a vast royal hunting chase. In 1066, Winchester Bishopric held the land of Chute as part of its estate. By the end of the 12th century, the Bishop of Winchester was active in the clearing forestland for cultivation. The population at nearby villages Birkler and Highclere increased considerably. 59. With the income from increased rents and tithes, the bishop turned the whole area into an ecclesiastical park. As far as I can ascertain, Limmer Copse and Limmer Pond were so named during this period of renovation. Travelers traveling the well-worn road from Cirencester to Winchester used a pond marked as being in this vicinity from some time before. Diggers may have put it there in Roman times. Modifications to the pond appear to be carried out during the period of the Bishop William's improvements. The second pond was landscaped on the southern side, so designed for the overflow from the first pond to waterfall into the second to cater for the increased volume of water needed for the development. From this time on, its name has been Limmer Pond. 59. From 1209 to 1255, there was a six-fold increase in rent from pound 4.4 L0D to 29 pounds and an increase in new land of 800 acres. By 1275, the rent roll stood at pound 36.10s.8d, which represented a further addition of 300 acres. In view of the very small size of the original settlement at Woodhay, it is possible that the colonization of the manor provided an outlet for the whole of the Clear group, and it was settled by peasants coming from the surrounding manors. Page 72. History of Limmers using the Huggitry method. 60 of dating. It would appear that this copse was also renewed or replanted during this period. The replanting would have been necessary in order to have a clear hunting chase from the Bishop's Park to the Common while skirting around Upper Chute. 60. I have tried, unsuccessfully, to get an archaeological dating on the age of Limmer Copse and have therefore turned to this crude estimate of dating. I cannot find any evidence of Limmers being in this area before this development. They may have been, but I think it more likely the bishop employed them from another part of his see. There is good evidence that Limmers worked for the bishop at Guildford shortly after this period. We will take a look at this in a moment, but it is not easy to determine if Guildford came before Chute or vice versa. Meet the family S. We come to this period of history, we start name-dropping. We first look at one other landmark. This is not particularly a Limmer landmark, but rather a place where we find several Limmers. At the same time, we can link these Limmers indirectly to other Limmers living in Hampshire by the 14th century. In 1274 AD, the widow of Henry II, Queen Eleanor, founded a house for Dominican friars at Guildford. Edward I granted to the friars the right to enclose the roads leading from Guildford to the Royal Park and enlarged the whole area for an ecclesiastical park. Known as the Preachers of Gildeford, mainly because it served as a seminary, by 1324 AD this friary housed 24 brothers and a large number of skilled support staff to service its numerous guest rooms. Its huge gardens included herb gardens for medicine, orchards, and well-landscaped horticultural rarities from around the world. So grand was the friary that it attracted most nobility to its hospitality. One king booked the friary for a royal party. So riotous was the party that on leaving, he presented £2 to cover the cost of damage to vessels and gardens 61. The mother of Edward II requested that the friary be given over to Dominican sisters. Edward wrote to Pope John XXII in 1318-9, sending 2 Dominican friars to plead in person. The Bishop of Winchester, under whose see the friary resided, proposed this nunnery might better be sited in Hampshire at the Rectory of 61. The evidence for this information can be found in a number of local history books at the Guildford Reference Library. 62 making representation to the Pope, the Bishop won the day 63. There were 3 Limmers working at the friary near that time: William, 1389.3, John, 1390.3, and John, 1416.4. 64. This story is told because it is a link between 3 other Limmer landmarks: Kingsclere, Limmer Copse and Pond, which formed part of the lands in Nunnery of Highclere, and Great Limmer Farm, which, as a tax storehouse for the Winchester See, indirectly if not directly supplied the friars of Guildford. The clear finding of 3 Limmers acting as assistants in the friary, and the friary writings acknowledging that these workers were seconded to kings and gentry for horticultural landscaping and building in return for substantial donations to the friary, links nicely with the landscaping of Limmer Copse and Limmer Pond around the same time, begs a connection. We will return to William, John, and young John in a moment. Now, as they say, let's meet the family. Top of the list of discoveries are 2 Limmers from Limmer 65. John Limmer, born around 1225 AD 66, was a practical man of the building trade. Of course, it was all wooden buildings for the 62 we have already seen. Kingsclere was where Limmer estates were established. 63. As a matter of interest, in 1336, the Pope ordered the Bishop of Winchester to reconcile the differences with one Arnold Lymme who had left the convent, presumably with others, over doctrinal differences. 64. William Bassett's will NRO FLT 1/16823 by 365. The records show William as of Limmer, which suggests he came from Limmer, Kingsclere. The other 2 are not identified by a place but are clearly of the same family. 66. We are guessing at the birth dates because the records only show when the companies were set up, but the fact that William was from Limmer in Hampshire, moved to Norfolk and set up a business at the same time as 2 other Limmers suggests they moved down as a family. But brickworks mortared with lime was the up-and-coming thing. Presumably John, 1235 U, was the father because he established the company as Limmer Company in 1260 AD. William, 1243. Limmer took over the business in 1265, renaming it as William Limmer Company 67. Adam, 1245 U. Limmer branched out in Cambridge the same year as Adam Limmer Company. Little more than this is known of these men, and there is a gap before our next Limmers are found in Norfolk. Thomas, 1290 U. Limmer 68, born c. 1290, and his wife Emma, owned a moiety 69 and a messuage at Wallingford. It seems Thomas was late in paying his Crusade tax in 1317 AD, and a writ had been taken out on his property. Thomas was not alone, as there was a very bad harvest that year 70. Richard Le Barber, the King's Crusade tax collector 71, drew up a bond to pay the tax, redeem the writ, and reclaim the value of 40 shillings from Thomas and his wife from the farm in the form of produce 72. Pushing northwest from here to Bishop's Manor near Whitney, Robert, 1317 U. Limmer, 73 partnership with one John Wheelu, leased the 467, possibly the year John, 1225 U. Died 68, reading RO with RTB 54. Wallingford, November 1317 Sunday Street, Martins, the Bishop to Edward II 69 moiety equals part share, messuage equals dwelling. 70 Britain in the crusading years. 71 Richard Le Barber, parliamentary burgesses for Colchester. The men behind the mask. Office holding in East Anglian boroughs, 1272-1460-72. Comment. It sounds like a fiddle going on to me. It does not say how much the original tax was, but the going rate was about a half of that. 73 page 563 The Register of Bishop of Eddington. Winchester Records, office page 80 family _1. Thomas, 1290 U. Emma family _2. Robert, 1317 U. 13s 4D in January 1347. John Limmer was born c. 1360 AD at Great Limmer Farm. John grew up on the farm and eventually took over its running until 1409 AD. John, 1360 had taken over the lease from his father when he died. Since then he had raised at least 2 sons, and his influence with the Bishop of Winchester had been useful in securing them work in a new venture being undertaken by the bishop. By 1409 AD, Black Death had taken its toll on the family of Limmers in Hampshire. John's close family may well have fallen victim to this plague. At the death of John in 1409 AD 74, the farm passed from the Limmer line. On the death of John, 1390.3, the bishop informed the male relatives in accordance with the custom of the manor, but none of these wanted to take up their rightful option on the farm 75. The bishop then agreed one John Lisle and his wife Isabel should be rightful tenants upon payment of an entrance fee of 3 shillings and 4 pence. Isabel may have been a sister of John and William who had married into the Lisle family. This seems likely because John and Isabel only paid an entrance fee costs and not a full new contract fee required by new tenants. This was a concession given to those taking over a contract within a family or descending through a daughter of the family. 74 I suspect but cannot prove that John died of the Black Death, especially with rats running around the grain store. 75 we know there were at least 2 relatives entitled to take up this option working in Guildford Friary at the time. The option probably seemed like a poor deal to them, as they would have had to give up what seems to be both lucrative and influential jobs. The manorial code was written in such a way as exclude gentleman farmers or part-time farmers. Page 81 Family _ 3 John, 1360 U. William, 1389.3 John, 1390.3 16 1/2 acres with another messuage in 1/6 part of 1 acre of land, surrounded by 11 acres of arable 1 rood of pasture land 76 nearby 77. This second site later became the site of the rebuilt Limmer cottages previously mentioned. 78 This farm finally became a housing estate in the 1950s, and the only remaining memory today is Limmer Lane marks the western boundary of the original farm. The 2 sons, William and John, learned building and landscape gardening 79. John, 1390.3, and William, 1389.3, lived in the tenements built by the Bishop of Winchester while the Friary and the Church of the Holy Trinity were still under his care at the beginning of the 14th century. Possibly, John and William helped build these workers' tenements along with the guest houses frequented by kings and nobility, sampling the friars' extravagant hospitality. How these 2 came into the bishop's employ is not proven, but given the link with Great Limmer Farm and their father's association with the bishop, it seems a logical route. John's 1360 father and his uncles had lived at Great Limmer Farm. Thus, a good relationship with the bishopric cemented. There is no evidence to tell if William, 1389.3, married, but John, 1390.3, did. By 76 Pipe Rolls 1409 Bishopric of Winchester 77 presently situated on the south side of the M40 motorway 78 Ibid 79 These 2, and the son of John worked in Guildford Friary but not as friars. Guildford Friary was renowned for its building and gardens, and its workers were loaned out to many aristocracy including kings in exchange for healthy donations to the bishopric.